Hello and welcome to 12D. In this section, we are going to talk about segmented worms, mainly focusing on the earthworm because that is a prime example of a segmented worm. We're going to talk about pretty much the makeup of the earthworm, like its muscles, how it moves, what it eats, what are the insides of it like, what are the nerves, and so on and so forth. So very interesting, very informative, so let's get started. So the phylum that the earthworms belong to is called Annelida, and basically the thing that distinguishes earthworms from other worms that you may see or come across is that they have segmented body parts, but they aren't the only ones that have segmented body parts. There are other worms like leeches, tubed worms, fireworms, scale worms, and sandworms that all have this kind of, body type. They're all segmented. Now, we talked about the term epidermis when it came to plants. And when we came to plants, we said that the epidermis was the outer layer of the plant. It was super thin so that it could allow oxygen to come in and out, or CO2, exchange gases with the environment. And it's true for the worm as well. Even though the worm is not a plant, the worm also has an epidermis. So do us as humans. And basically the epidermis is a thin skin that covers the earthworm's body. And the reason that it's important that it has to be thin is because it is able to exchange gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen with the environment. The epidermis has to make sure that it's also moist in order for gas exchange to occur, and also to protect the worm itself. The epidermis also secretes a outer covering called the cuticle, which is also very thin. And the cuticle is there to protect the earthworm from bacteria, parasites, other things that could damage the worm or even kill it. And like I said, it has to be thin so that it can do the job of protecting and being moist and allow exchanges to occur. So if you look at this worm, I'm just going to point out that you can see the epidermis right here. You can see the cuticle. And then you can see just pretty much the makeup of the worm. We're going to talk about different parts of the worm as we get closer, or as we get further into the chapter. But this kind of just gives you the breakup of a worm, how complex it is actually, and pretty interesting as we go through it. Okay, so underneath the epidermis being the outside of the covering, we have two muscle layers. One muscle layer, the main job of the muscle layer is to help the worm be well supported so that it can move, and also just for the worm to have some sort of rigidity because it doesn't have a skeletal system like bones. So there are two types of muscles. The one muscle is going to go around the body of the worm, so it's going to encircle the body of the worm, and when these muscles contract, the worm is actually going to look larger and thinner. All right, and then the other muscle is arranged in long, this is supposed to say strips, and it runs from the head of the worm all the way down to the tail. And as these contract, the worm is going to become shorter and wider versus larger and thinner like the other worm that goes around, the other muscle that goes around the worm. Both of these working together is super important in how the worm is going to move. So how does the worm move? The earthworm is going to move by using its muscles, and there are little bristles that are called setae, all right? And the setae is going to be located pretty much in every single segment that the earthworm has. And this is what is going to help kind of move the earthworm forward, because it does this really cool thing where the setae actually anchors into the soil and pushes the worm forward. So the setae that are in the rear segments of the worm, they are going to anchor into the soil, and it's going to pretty much contract the circular muscles that it has, so that the earthworm is going to become long and thin, and it's going to push the worm forward. especially in the front part of the worm, okay? Then the earthworm is going to release the setae in the rear, and it's going to anchor the setae in the front part of the worm to the soil so that it can pull itself forward by contracting its long muscles. And this is going to be repeated over and over again until the earthworm can move. So I'm going to repeat this again. You have setae, which are little bristles in every segment of the earthworm. How it moves is that the setae that are in the rear segments of the worm are going to anchor itself into the soil, which is going to cause the circular muscles to become long and thin, causing the worm to become long and thin, and it's going to push the worm towards its front part. So it's going to push it forward. Then, once it's pushed forward, it's going to release the setae from the soil that was in the back. It's going to take the setae that's in the front segments of the worm, anchor that into the soil, and the worm will pull itself forward again. And that's why you see that worm move. Like, it looks like it's moving, the back first, then the front, back first, then the front as it moves forward. The body of the earthworm has a ton of sensory receptors. Basically, a sensory receptor is, it's going to sense a stimulus, so something external, and then, or it can be internal sometimes too, but mostly external, and then it's going to start an impulse that is pretty much a message that is being carried all the way down the nerve cell throughout the worm. So for example, if I have an earthworm that's moving on the ground, and it senses, it's being pecked at, right, by a bird, it's going to send an impulse, hey, we need to get out of here, we need to move. Or if the earthworm is making its way through the grass and suddenly it hits cement and it's a hot day, the stimulus is going to be that hot cement that's going to send an impulse throughout the worm saying, hey, you might not want to go on that hot cement sidewalk because you might get fried or eaten, or both. So the sensory receptors in the earthworm, they react to different things. They react to chemicals that are in the soil, whether they're natural or not. So sometimes like weed killers, other pesticides can, cause them to have the sensory receptor go off. Light, depending on what time of day it is. The temperature, like I said, the hot cement versus the cool soil and grass. And then there are also other conditions that the earthworm is receptive to as well. Okay, so impulses from the sensory receptors that are found in the front part of the worm is going to be carried to the third segment or the other segments in the worm through something called two large ganglia. And remember, ganglia we talked about in the flatworms are pretty much their simple brain. So it's pretty much this like nervous system that helps to communicate throughout the worm. Sensory receptors that are in the other parts of the worm are going to also send their impulses to the nerve cord, which is also located in the lower half of the worm. So pretty much you're trying to figure out how can we get communication from the front of the worm to the end of the worm. And one, it's through the nerve cord and also through the ganglia that the worm has. So what is the nerve cord? The nerve cord is a bundle of nerve tissue that begins at the two large ganglia, which is in the front of the worm, and then it continues all the way down to the tail of the worm. So this is pretty much like our nervous system. This is their nervous system. And then the ganglia coordinates impulses to the muscles, to the setae, and other structures that will enable the worm to respond properly to stimuli. So just like our brain helps to coordinate muscle movements for us, thought processes, all of this stuff, it's also going to do the same kind of for the nervous system, and the ganglia is going to do the same thing for the nervous system in the worm, where it's going to say, hey, we should move away from this, we should move towards this, we should move this way, or just stay still, so on and so forth. Okay, so here is a worm. You can see the setae that are right here, and those are those little things that you can see that are sticking out from the worm, right here. You can see the mouth of the earthworm. You can see the brain, which is known as a ganglia or ganglion. And then you can also see, let's see. You can see the ganglion also going all the way down the worm. And the blood vessels that are flowing down So it's very complex, actually, the worm. It doesn't look like it, but it is very complex. All right, digestive system. An earthworm often eats the soil that it forms as it forms the tunnels. So you know, obviously, that earthworms live in the earth, hence the name, and they do eat the soil. And the mouth, important, is that it's in the front of the worm, and it's going to help moisten the food so that it can be easily digested. There's also something called a pharynx, which is going to lubricate the food with mucus, saliva, whatever, as it passes through the esophagus of the worm. And the esophagus is basically a tubular passage like it is for us, and that is going to carry the food from the pharynx to the crop. And the crop is going to serve as a excuse me, temporary storage chamber for the food to be located in the earthworm. Okay, so let's look over here for a second. Okay, so you can see here that the pharynx is located right here. So that is where the food is going to get moist after, or lubricated once it comes in through the mouth. And then once in the pharynx, it's going to get digested and then go into storage in the crop, which is located right here. And then it will further get processed once some time goes by, or depending on when the earthworm needs that food to supply it with energy. Okay, so when the food leaves the crop, it's going to pass into something called the gizzard. If you know this, gizzard in chickens and stuff are actually a pretty big delicacy in certain countries. But once the food in the earthworm gets digested, it's going to leave the crop, go through the gizzard, and then muscles that are in the gizzard and on the worm itself is going to perform something called mechanical digestion. Basically, this means that you are moving your muscles so that you are able to grind the food that can be used against the sand and the grit particles that are found in the earthworm's food. So you're pretty much, separating the nutrients from things that you don't necessarily want to digest, but you have digested, right? And then the digestible parts will also move the intestine to be broken down by digestive enzymes into soluble substances into the bloodstream to the cells of the worm. Basically meaning that the intestine is going to further break down the food by using digestive enzymes so that solvable substances, as in substances that can go into the bloodstream through the walls of the intestine, can go into the bloodstream to supply the worm with more nutrients. The parts of the food that the earthworm has eaten that is not digestible is going to pass through the intestine, and then it's going to leave the digestive tract through the anus, and sometimes it will form piles outside of their hole that they have dug, known as casts. So this is actually a really cool thing. If you ever are walking on the grass and you notice little round pebbles that look like they're piled on top of each other, they look like little brown pebbles, you can know that there is probably an earthworm hole right there, because they poop right outside of the hole. They don't want to, go to the bathroom inside of the hole because then it would block it. So they would poop around the outside of the hole, and that's why, and that's one way that you can find earthworms. So if you ever go to the park or something, and you look down, you can sometimes see multiple mounds of this on the ground, and you'll know that an earthworm probably lives there or once did. Earthworms are also known as the intestines of the soil because they help to digest plant and animal matter. And they also secrete super rich minerals in their casts or their poop for plant growth. So that's why people say if you have earthworms in your garden, it's a really good thing, because they really do help break down things and supply nutrients to the soil. Earthworms also have a circulatory system. They have a closed circulatory system, which basically means that the blood is going to remain in the vessels of the worm, and it's going to go throughout the entire body of the earthworm. And it's called closed because it never leaves the worm's body. So the blood is not going to leak out. It also has something called a large dorsal blood vessel, which basically means that on the back of the earthworm, it's going to have this large dorsal blood vessel that's going to act as the heart of the earthworm. And it's going to pump the blood forward to the 5 sets of aortic arches that it has. And this is going to help control the earthworm's blood pressure. So as it's moving, as it's in the ground, you have this system of network of blood vessel and aortic arches that's going to help maintain the earthworm's blood pressure. Yes, even earthworms have blood pressure. Pretty cool. As the blood passes through the aortic arch, which controls the blood pressure, it's going to go down to something called the ventral blood vessel. And this is going to carry the blood along the bottom of the earthworm. Remember that I said the dorsal blood vessel is going to carry blood towards the back. It's going to be on the back of the earthworm. One way that you can remember this is dorsal. If you think of a dorsal fin, right? Dorsal fin of a fish is always located on the back of the fish, right? So dorsal. So even as humans, when we talk about anatomy, the dorsal part of a human is our back. And then the ventral is our front side. But in the case of the earthworm, it's the underside. So this is going to carry blood along the bottom of the earthworm to every segment of the earthworm's body. Okay, so in a closed circulatory system, you have something called arteries, which are going to carry blood away from the heart. Okay? Arteries away. So away from the heart. So as this happens, the blood is going to pass through these arteries and enters the tiniest blood vessels called capillaries, which is true in humans as well. And as the blood passes through the capillaries, it's going to move into the veins. And then the veins are going to carry the blood towards the heart. And then the tiny veins are going to collect the blood and send it to larger veins, which send blood to the dorsal. Okay, so let's talk about respiratory, excretory, and reproductive system of the earthworm. So the respiratory system basically is how does the earthworm exchange gases with their environment. Like we said before, they do it basically through their moist skin. That's why it's important that the epidermis and the outside part of the skin is very thin and moist. And it doesn't have any special respiratory structure. So they don't have lungs, they don't have any of that, but their skin is the main part in exchanging oxygen as it comes in with carbon dioxide as it leaves. So super important that it's thin and moist. Okay, so pretty much like we said, the earthworm, it has a bunch of segments, right? So the first and the last segments of the earthworm, they have tiny looped tubes that collect waste from the earthworm's blood, okay? So the first and the last segments have these tiny loop tubes that are going to collect the waste. The waste that are collected in these excretory tubes are going to be passed out of the body of the earthworm through tiny pores that are on the earthworm's surface. All right, so first and last segment of the earthworm have tiny looped tubes that are going to collect any waste that are from the blood of the earthworm. And then they're going to dispel them from the body through tiny pores that are on the surface of the earthworm. Earthworms are hermaphroditic, which basically means that they have both female and male reproductive parts in one worm. Oops, forgot the other part. So basically this means this is just similar to the planarian that we talked about. So they can either play the role of being female or male. They do reproduce sexually, and they also have the ability to regenerate missing sections. So they can grow back anything that has been cut off. But they do it rarely, and they also rarely reproduce asexually through the process of regeneration when, say, for example, their head or tail has been cut off.